Welcome to another episode of Saints and Sinners Unplugged. I'm Ken Jones, pastor of Glendale Baptist Church, joined by our regular co-hosts. We have Jose Prado, who's the pastor of Christ Family Church, Aldo Leon from Pinelands Presbyterian, and David Menendez from Miami-Dade Baptist Church. We are four local pastors here in South Miami. We get together each week at this time to discuss various aspects of Reformed theology, its implications, the content of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This, by the way, happens to be our 200th episode, so sort of a milestone. I wish I had some confetti to throw in the air and something other than coffee to drink to make a toast, but we've made 200 episodes. Seems like only yesterday, right?
Yeah. Wow. We need some patio time again. Patio time to celebrate.
There you go. Yeah, no, it really does. It seems like
it's a celebratory.
How many years is that?
Man,
like 3 or 4.
Does anybody know?
Going on 4, maybe. I'm not sure.
We started around 2017, I guess, 2018, 2017.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're out there and you guys have listened to us, let us know. At least tell us hello, congratulations on 200 episodes, and any input that you have on any of the discussions that we've had.
And we'll take gifts too. We'll take gifts as well.
Gifts, sure, absolutely. Well, we want to get started, and our topic is suffering. And, we want to look at it from different vantage points. Recently, I spoke at a conference on the sovereignty of God. And during the Q&A session, a question was raised about how do we view God's sovereignty in light of suffering? And my response was pretty much along the lines of, we live in a cursed creation, that all of the human race exists post-Adam under the judgment of God. So therefore, in general, suffering is a consequence of our fallen, rebellious nature. So all sickness, disease, dysfunctions, deformities, all conflicts, the two-seed conflict that we talk about. So in general, even though we know that God's judgment is being restrained until the end, but in general, he has really left us over to reprobate minds. It doesn't mean that there's not evidence of his common grace where he allows us to continue to function. But I think any substantial biblical understanding of suffering has to begin with the understanding that we live in a cursed creation, and that therefore all of those other disorders and dysfunctions are a result of that.
Yeah, this is among those issues that cause quite a little bit of stumbling to the new believer and to old alike. I've seen Christians befuddled. I think we ourselves, at some point during times of trials, we may become perplexed at why this has come upon us, but it may really cause many to trip in their faith, especially those that are beginning the faith, and particularly in the current evangelical environment, where people are being told to come to Christ to stop suffering, to improve their lives, to become wealthy and successful. So the setup is there. The setup is there by the enemy to disappoint people in God and in God's kingdom. So it's a subject that needs discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
No, and go ahead, Aldo.
Yeah, I think trivializing suffering, and also the trivialization of things, and also the misunderstanding of things is one of the things that I think causes a lot of unnecessary ill repute to like gospel ministry. So I think we can be overly dismissive of things with like this kind of like over-realize Christianity. And also, I think we can, at the same time, have this. I think I like to call it the nouthetic, the nouthetic dysfunctionality of ministering, where everything in suffering comes down to some kind of morality issue that you can autocorrect by obedience. And so, yeah, I think that when the Bible talks about suffering, it does so with a very creation, fall, redemption, not oversimplified, unnuanced way that I think does due diligence to the whole conversation.
Yeah, I think by way of a general principle that may be applicable here from the world of counsel, I think it comes also from a philosophy that has certain overlapping points with Christianity, is that people are most affected not primarily by circumstances, but by the way they view their circumstances. And that could go both ways. On the one hand, you could view circumstances in a very unrealistic, pink and rose, kind of way, or you could view your circumstances in a very pessimistic, completely hopeless kind of world. So we want to bring a biblical view of reality, and that is important so that we could put our suffering in the right frame, and receive then God's counsel and comfort in the midst of our circumstances, but having the right view, that cognitive piece of how we are facing the world in which we live is very important.
Yeah, I was going to say that in a summary fashion, that processing pain and suffering in light of the ultimacy of the ultimate sufferer is the X factor. I think when you process suffering and victimization and pain and brokenness, not within the paradigmatic cosmic worldview of the ultimate sufferer, all those perspectives become screwed up.
Yeah. Well, part of the misconceptions that people have about suffering is we look at God, and especially from a Christian perspective, or even from non-believers, but what we know about God is being a loving God and a caring God and all powerful. So it's hard for sinners to reconcile the fact that God is all loving, or God is loving, God is powerful, God is all of the attributes that we see in scriptures about God, that he's all knowing. And it's hard for us to conceive that a loving, all-powerful God can see the depths of human suffering and not respond to it. Now, that's obviously a stretch. And so what ends up happening is non-believers, therefore, have a tendency to reject that God. But then from the vantage point of Christians, what we have a tendency to do is try to rationalize, or as you mentioned, Aldo, trivialize suffering in such a way that we don't see the sovereignty of God even as it relates to suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. We don't. Go ahead, man.
No, we begin to see the world not for what it is, but for what we would like it to be. In other words, the idolatrous heart that has made a fake God unto himself also produces a fake view of the world based on their own fantasies and illusions, rather than the world that God has designed and that God has ordained providentially, even after the fall.
And you said that unbelievers tend to reject the view of God being a just and righteous and good, benevolent God. But what I've found is not only do unbelievers reject that, but professing believers reject that. I mean, it's amazing to me in the counseling area how many professing believers I come across with that they might not say it as bluntly as unbelievers do. But honestly, man, like they're wrestling hard with the idea that God is good when they have experienced the suffering that they've experienced.
Yeah. Yeah. Even more so. I think sometimes it seems even more so because they actually have a knowledge of God. And so I think when you begin to know somebody, you have an actual relationship with them that's at least has some level of awareness and intimacy and proximity. And so being near to God and confusing the God that you are near to, it can bring a complexity of emotions that someone who's far from God wouldn't have. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And those emotions produce a variety of responses. And one of those responses is definitely one of denial. When you have suffered deeply and you have experienced great trauma, one of the things that your brain wants to do is to shut it off. And one of those responses is denial. So we have to really be sensitive to this and understand that. Perhaps at a cosmic spiritual level, humanity is living the shock of the fall with a universal sense of denial and escapism. And we need to ease them into the kingdom somehow. Sometimes it takes a shock, but yeah.
So obviously, in a finite world with a finite, kind of understanding and mentality, what can we say regarding the goodness of God and yet the existence of evil and suffering in our world?
Well, and
what
yeah,
can
that's
we say?
that's
How can
that's
we- how
where
can-
no, that's where the rub comes in. That can we explain the fact of human suffering in light of the God who is revealed in Scripture without trivializing the suffering or recasting God? That's really the challenge. And I agree with you, Jose, that there are a lot of Christians that when they are in the crucible of suffering, that they sound like, they have the same sort of questions about how can a good God, do this or allow me to go through this. And then I think in some instances, even to the point of, but I love the Lord. And we have a tendency at that point to kind of fall back on, well, I don't deserve this. And
why are you
it's
doing
a
this to
difficult thing.
me?
Yeah. And that, I mean, obviously, like, we have to be very careful with what specifically is going on with each person.
Yeah.
But I do think that with a lot of people, the reason why this is such a enigma is because there isn't this understanding of the fall in our first representative, and his treasonous action that we all participate in, both by him imputing those actions to us and also us acting out of that state that we have received from him. They don't understand the depravity and destruction and evil of man, and therefore there's this never-ending perplexity about why do bad things happen to assumingly not so bad people. And I think when you begin to think about the way God tells his story about creation and fall, you begin to ask different questions. And the questions you start to ask is, why does anything good happen? Why is there so much common grace? Why did you don't ask, why did God drown everyone but Noah and his family? You ask, why did not Noah and his family be drowned with them? But you're never going to be able to deduce those things if you're not operating out of a biblical understanding of what is deeply wrong with us in the first Adam.
Yeah, that failure to understand the fall and the federal representation of the first Adam and the condition and the state in which you're in, united to that first Adam in the flesh, it's a misdiagnosis that leads to all kinds of different doctrines of sin and anthropology that then would lead to misapplication of fixes and solutions, right?
Yeah. Now, I think that the questions do get a little even deeper than that, though. When people just come to the question of like, well, why did evil exist in the first place? Like, why would God present Adam with this choice of, hey, you can have all the trees in the garden, everything you have access to, but this one tree. Why I think that's where most people kind of like wrestle with, is like, did God, in other words, here's the question: did God create evil?
No.
Yeah, well, that's the question of the broader theological category of theodicy.
Yeah.
And
well, I think
go ahead, David. You're our resident.
No, just to reflect that's like the ultimate push, right? I think Jose just took it to the ultimate push.
Yeah.
When it comes to this reflection. So just go ahead and offer your commentary.
No, I think ultimately, if we're saying, does God make evil inherently, directly? The answer to that is no. But he created angels or spirit beings and humans who had the ability to either remain in a state of obedience and submission or rebel against it. And it's within that, in that realm right there, that ability to consciously submit and obey, or to consciously rebel and reject. So the evil is the result of choosing not to remain in a state of submission. Right. So in that sense, did he create Satan? Yes, he did. But it was Satan chose to willingly rebel against God. So
I think the language. No, the language of the confession at that point is that God ordained to permit.
Yes.
So it was within his ordination, but it was by a permission, meaning that he does not actively cause or produce from himself evil, but it's by the nature of secondary causes and their freedom, as God has intended within and according to their nature, that then these situations occurred, such as the fall of Satan and the fall of man. Definitely within God's ordination, but not by his infusion, injecting and causing evil from himself.
Satan doesn't rebel because it was his nature to rebel. In other words, he doesn't necessarily sin. Yeah. He does so out of free will. And does God know what Satan is going to do? Yes, he does. And therefore he permits it, but he doesn't cause it. So he's not the cause of the sin, but he created him with the ability to either remain in his original state, as with Adam, or not.
Yeah.
I like the way. I mean, and I don't know if we would all agree on this, but I kind of like the way that Augustine spoke about evil, and as God being the one who created all things, everything in the universe created by God, but yet evil not being like a substance or not being like a thing that was created, but being the privation or the lacking of, something, right? Mm-hmm. And so, man declares his independence from God. Therefore, evil is the lacking of that dependency to God, right? Or so in other words, it's kind of like what you were saying, Ken. I mean, evil is not necessarily something God creates. It's kind of like the fruit, the result of
exactly
this lack that there is now in the creation, right?
I was gonna say something else. I mean, I think you guys were talking a bit about, and with the theodicy question about like how did it come to be? But here's another like I guess thought as well. Ephesians 1:3, it talks about the Father who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenlies. He chose us before the foundation of the world. Verse 6, the praise of his glorious grace, which he has blessed us in the beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses. Verse 9, making known to us the mystery of his will according to his purpose, which he has set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. And then it says, this was to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has blessed us in the beloved. So the why of God ordaining evil by his decree, but not creating evil, is about the fact that a fall was the way in which God would be known by his image bearers in a way that was unique. And so you see this in Peter, where it talks about, angels long to look into the things that we who have experienced redemption have. So in some sense, when you think about all the depravity that has happened and all the evil, that was a stage which God chose to make known the things that are eternally true about him. And so why all this evil? Why did I have to be born in sin and death, destined to hell? Because God, in his infinite wisdom, chose that him redeeming me by grace and all that depravity would be the way in which I would know his beauty in ways were it not, if it didn't happen. And so that, you don't want to say too much about that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do think that's what God says.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's warranted. Yeah.
God says, look, the reason why all this stuff, I have decreed this stuff, is because you will know something about me in eternity because of what I have done with you undoing things. And so I'm, in some sense, this is going to sound like a bit perplexing, but my sin that put Jesus on the cross is what actually leads me to love and enjoy God deeply.
Absolutely.
I think what saves...
Jesus said that, right? Jesus said that, right? I mean, he who was forgiven much loves much, Yeah,
it's when we have these discussions in the abstract that a kind of extreme superlapsarianism could kind of affect the understanding. But if we ground, like Aldo has done, the view in a very Christ-centered view of God's plan for an eschatological plan that is Christ-centered to exalt Christ, then I think that indeed the distinction between God and the creature, the God that is totally different from the creature, that through the fall and the sufferings of Christ enters the passibility, the impassible God entering the passibility of man, the infinite God entering the finitude of man and identifying with the creature. There's something to be said there for how God enters into fellowship with man, with the creature, that is very close to us without trying to decipher, but maintaining the creaturely divine distinction. But it does really seem to exalt and magnify the wonders of redemption and the incarnation and the gospel forever and ever in union with Christ.
And there is, at some level, we cannot fully answer or explain the why. We can explain the fact of. In other words, we can acknowledge from Scripture that everything that exists is under the sovereign control of God and according to his own eternal purposes and counsel. So there is nothing that exists, material or immaterial, that is not according to his purpose.
Yeah, because we have to say that.
Why this? Yeah. Why this? Why does he allow? Why does he allow angels to fall? Therefore, we have Satan. We can't. At some point, we can't explain the why of it, but we do know that what he has permitted is still according to his purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we went really high to some high theodicy there, and I think we have said some of the things that have been said.
Yeah, and
I think,
and I also think too, like, we're talking about like what we know now, but a lot of the evil that God is working for good, the good of knowing something about his glory through what he does with evil. I think that you have to think about that will not be resolved until Babylon is finally experienced its full judgment that it experienced 2,000 years ago in its last phase. So we have to see what God does in the consummation with evil for us to truly, I guess, step into, wow, look at how God majestically did what he did with evil. I think there, in some sense, we can taste that now.
Sure.
But a lot of believers die perplexed about the miseries and God's providence. But it doesn't mean that's the final experience or say.
Well, let me piggyback on that.
Great point.
Let me piggyback on that, Aldo, because I recently addressed this in my message on the sovereignty of God, that all of human history is moving towards a twofold eschatological end in which in which God will be glorified to the highest degree. And that is in the ultimate condemnation or the consummation of his judgment against evil and the consummation of his grace in redeeming sinners. Yeah. And that's not going to be fully realized until the eschaton, until the end of the age. Because both of those things, we experience both of them by degrees. Even those of us right now who are saved, we rejoice in God's saving grace, but the fullness of our salvation and everything that entails will not be revealed until the fullness of his glory is manifest, both in condemnation and the eternal judgment of the wicked and the eternal reward for those that he has saved by grace.
Ken, if I could back it up again to what Aldo said a moment ago, because I think that's a great note of pastoral insight and comfort, that sometimes you have this view both in life and in death for the believer that is hyper glorified. It's a glory train. Yeah. And I have had close people, in my family die perplexed and not happy with the way they're dying and bucking that death. And they're believers and they have this spirit. So sometimes you have this view that, we're just going to die, in great comfort and saying hallelujahs and singing the praises. But to be able to recognize that there is such degree of suffering in the world that is so perplexing that in the moment of death even does not really, it just really makes us undone. It causes us sometimes to just be at our wits' end, even at the last moment.
Well, in
and that's important.
in our next session, we're gonna deal very specifically with
Okay.
suffering in the life of believers. But no,
Yeah.
that's a very strong point, and it is part of our pastoral duty as ministers of the gospel.
One of the things to speak to that, because I'm reminded of when the friends of Job's came along and they saw how greatly he was suffering, that they sat for 2 weeks and said not a word, even though we have this theology and all of these great things that have their moment. But I think that ministry of presence and silence in deep, acute suffering is where it begins.
We're gonna deal specifically with believers and kind of touch on some of those issues. Go ahead, Aldo.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think, what Dave is bringing up is just the, being wise, not just right, but timely.
Yes.
Because I when I hear Dave say that, I hear someone else say, yeah, I don't do theology. I don't talk theology and people are suffering. I just hug them and cry. Like, well, you know what? People need theology when they suffer.
Absolutely.
But timeliness, wisdom, and nuance is appropriate. But miss me with the, like theology is not the answer. Yes, it is. I mean, when
it's the ultimate answer.
First Peter is like, hey, you guys are suffering under, the beast and Babylon, and I'm going to give you a theology of the cross in your suffering. He didn't just say, oh, I love you and it's okay and I understand and we don't need to talk about any theological things. Like,
in Second Corinthians 2 as well. Like, we're, it's the comfort that we receive in the gospel.
Absolutely,
is the comfort that we will give to others in their suffering.
And theology, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking within the context of Babylon and the city of man, it diagnoses the problem of suffering that compounds it before God. And that is that Babylon is always trying to arrive when God had said after the fall, you will never arrive. In other words, God has already passed judgment. That theological piece that Paul says, that God subjected the world to vanity, not willingly. Creation does not want to do that. But the rebellion of man is that after the fall, based on their own diagnosis, they want to fix on their own. They want to arrive. They want to build all the way to the end, to finality and ultimacy. And God has set it up so that that ultimacy and that finality can never be attained. And that's a God thing, so that we will come to his mercy and to his son.
Well, and that's why we can't, we don't have to apologize for the world that God has allowed. And we have to begin any serious discussion on suffering with the sovereignty of God. None of this is by surprise, and it is accomplishing a particular divine purpose. But it doesn't make God guilty. It's because of human guilt that we see these things. So it is important for us to be able to at least not try to make excuses for God, nor do we try to hide from the reality of the world being under a curse. Because I think sometimes we get God's common grace, just like people take God's saving grace for granted. God's common grace can be taken for granted. And so we look at a beautiful sunny day and we think we deserve this all the time. And we forget that the reason there are earthquakes, the reason there are tsunamis, the reason there are locks on our doors, the reason there are hospitals and cemeteries is because God has subjected the creation to a curse in response to the fall of his image bearers.
And by the same token, Ken, we'll look at a sunny day and we're having the greatest of time. And if we have not internalized the frustration, the vanity of this world, and we still have that, sense of angst and dissatisfaction inside, and we're in the best of possible circumstances and we're not feeling quite right, if we don't know that that's normal. It's okay to be
Right.
frustrated. It's okay to be frustrated in the best of marriages. It's okay to be frustrated in the best of financial situations. It's okay to be frustrated in the best of your sanctified life, because that is the nature of what we're going through right now.
Yeah, I think that's a huge, I think, discourager and reason why people buy into weird theology and bad missiology is like there's this refusal to embrace the fact that you are supposed to be miserable before the world is renewed. Like you're supposed to be miserable. No matter how much comfort you have by common grace or how much hopefulness you have by redemptive grace, you are still supposed to be groaning in labor pains.
We're groaning. Yep. That's exactly right.
And anybody that tries to undo that is virtually undoing, I think, so much of what Christianity says about so many things.
Yep. And well, then we'll. Yeah, go ahead. I think we have to.
I was going to go ahead and wrap this portion of it up.
Yeah,
and then we'll take up in our next discussion. We'll bring it even more to bear on the Christian life and Christians in general, mistakes that we make, and whether it's in a dismissive way or sometimes over spiritualizing. But we'll look at some of those particulars in our next session. But no, I think this has been very helpful. But anyways, thank you guys for joining us here on Saints and Sinners. We look forward to being with you next time as we continue this discussion from a different vantage point. Nothing but the blood of Jesus.